What is up, YouTube? Welcome back to another TCG tier list video. Now, this is going to be post Phantom Nightmare, right? The huge set that is right around the corner and is going to add a whole lot of new stuff into the game. And I want to preface this tier list with two things. The first thing is this is my very first impression of these decks, right? We're going to probably go back and reevaluate what I'm thinking of these decks in a couple weeks or months down the line, see if this was correct or not. But more importantly, take it with a grain of salt. I haven't had that much time to test each and every single deck, but people always ask me, what's your first impression of this deck? How do you think that deck's going to perform? So that's what we're going to discuss today, right? We're going to go through mostly new decks. And when I say mostly, I mean that I have included some of the decks that are already out there, but also a lot of new stuff, right? And in order to keep it relatively condensed and only focus or mostly focus on the new stuff, I haven't included that many existing decks, only what I deemed to be some of the more popular decks. If there's anything missing from this tier list that you want my opinion on, as always in these videos, leave a comment down below and I always try to go through all of these, right? That being said, I want to start this by saying I believe the Fire King Snake Eye deck is going to be the best deck in the upcoming format unless some crazy new discoveries are being made, which is not impossible. For now, I think this is what people are going to pivot towards. And I did not label it as tier 0, the category, on purpose this time. I think it's safe to say that this deck is going to be the best deck. I'm not sure if it's going to be a tier 0 deck. I don't even know what the exact definition of a tier 0 deck is. I think it's different from depending on who you ask. The deck is incredible. It's got the consistency. It's got the grind game. It's got the non-engine spaces, layered disruptions. You're not being blown out by a single Dark Ruler or a single evenly match because you have stuff that functions from your graveyard, stuff that functions from your back row. It's a phenomenal deck. You even got some stuff from your hand with like the Fire King cards and Kyrian and stuff. It's just phenomenal. Rescue Ace, I think, quite frankly, is not going to see that much play because if you have the money to get the Snake Eye cards, I don't see a huge reason to play Rescue Ace over the Fire King Snake Eye deck. That doesn't change the fact that it still remains a strong deck, but it's not better than Fire King. I wanted this to be the first two decks that we rate because the Fire decks are going to be the benchmark for everything else. The most important part of the format is how do these decks revolve around, how are the fire matchups and all that kind of stuff. I didn't put a Runic Earthbound in, but I'm pretty sure the editor can bail me out. It's gonna be tough. Everything that isn't a fire deck is gonna have a rough time into the fire decks because the boards are very hard to break. I think Runic Bestial probably falls into the rogue category, and that is including my personal bias, simply because I don't think the Bestials offer you that much in terms of being solid non-engine when it comes to the upcoming format. I think if you want to play a Runic deck, you can try your hands at the Runic Earthbound or the Runic Sprite for Hire, which I think are still solid decks. I'm going to put them towards the lower end of B tier, I think, but in case you do want to play a Runic deck, I think it's either going to be the Earthbound or the Runic Sprite for Hire. You're probably going to have to go first to consistently beat Fire King. Against most of the other meta decks, you're going to be okay. Unchained is a deck that, despite people really getting off of it in the last couple weeks, I still personally think Unchained remains a playable deck. However, I think compared to what we are getting in Phantom Nightmare, I think I have no choice but putting it into the rogue category. The deck still functions with one Sharvara, but I'm gonna be honest with you, even if they did not hit Sharvara at all, Unchained was probably going to be here at best. Branded is okay. I've heard that Branded has solid matchups into some of the fire decks. I have yet to confirm that myself. It depends a little bit on what kind of non-engine people play as well. I think there's a world where you can benefit off of people playing some non-engine that isn't as good against Branded. This also kind of includes Chimera. For me personally, I'm not in love with Branded, but I think it's somewhere between upper B, lower A. Centurion is like a solid deck. I don't see myself favoring Centurion over other decks in the upcoming format, but Centurion is okay, especially since we still have Calamities. We've got Shifter decks. I'm pretty convinced that Exosister is vibing somewhere in the rogue category. The same is true for Flu in some ways. Kashtira might break the barrier towards like solid because it's been performing in the last couple weeks. I think if I was going to look into a shifter deck, it would be Kashtira. I don't think it's A. I don't think it's good enough for that. I think it's a solid B tier deck. Labyrinth is getting a lot stronger. Like Transaction Rollback and the Black Goat Laughs are incredible cards for Labyrinth. The problem with Labyrinth is that the Fire King matchup is tough. So even though Labyrinth gets a huge boost from this new set and also from Maze of Millennia, it's still not going to be looking the greatest. It's kind of like how last format Labyrinth was looking really solid, but it had a really hard matchup against Unchained, which at some point was the most played deck, and that hurt Labyrinth's win rate a lot. And it's kind of the same here. Fire King is something you struggle against, and I have a hard time evaluating that, you know, because in a nutshell, like Labyrinth is a strong deck for sure. Like I would throw it here. If you really care about having the best possible matchups into Fire King though, like I think it would more be like a B tier deck. I wouldn't hate this either. The order stays the same, right? Whether you put them into A or B, I guess is up to you. It's down to personal preference as well. Like I personally think Lab looks like hell of a good deck into most things that aren't Fire King. It also is looking like a deck that is going to be very strong against most of the non-engine that people play, right? It doesn't care about Droll. It doesn't care about Super Poly. It doesn't care about Nib. Like those cards are going to be in people's decks, and Labyrinth benefits from that. So I think Labyrinth is going to have a great matchup against most decks that aren't Fire King, but the fact that Fire King is going to be the most played deck is definitely going to hurt. We've got Vanadium, which I would rate as a solid deck. I'm personally on the verge of like putting it even higher than that, but at the same time, it doesn't feel that good. Hand traps in general are popular. I think Vanadium struggles with the fact that Fire King as a deck has a lot of room for non-engine, which is always tough for decks that are weak to certain hand traps when the top tier deck in the format is playing a lot of those, right? Most of the Fire King lists that I've been seeing have been playing Droll. A lot of them have been playing Nib. People have been playing a lot of Super Poly. All of that can be troublesome for Vanadium. So I think it goes into the B tier. On top of that, it's not that great at going second. Plants have kind of the same problem as Vanadium, but they are even worse. I wanted to mention it because they are getting support from Phantom Nightmare. I think the new Aramage support is in there. I'm gonna put it in experimental, which is not necessarily the worst category, only because it's at the bottom. It just means that I'm not sure if it can do something, but if you want to, you can try it out. Try the new support, see if it changes anything. I have a hard time imagining Plants being able to perform with the hand traps that people are gonna play in the format. I don't think it's that great, but you can experiment with the new Aramage support and see if it does anything for you. I just can't bring myself to really love Pearly for the upcoming format. It's definitely not bad. Like I think putting it into Rogue while I've put other decks like Vanadium, Centurion, Runic, Sprite, Kashtira into solid, I don't feel like that's fair. Maybe I've been a little bit too lenient on what I call solid or not, but I think Pearly at least qualifies as a solid deck, right? I have a hard time calling it a rogue deck with the power level that it's at. Tearlaments, for some reason, refuses to die. I don't like Tearlaments in its current iteration. It's been performing pre-Phantom Nightmare, that's for sure. So maybe it's still B. I'm just looking at it in relation to the other decks here. Like, I think it's stronger than Unchained, Flu, Exosister, and Bestial Runic. I think it's weaker than some of the other decks I put into B tier. So it's like a low B tier for me personally. Pure Sprites seems like a rogue deck to me, which is hard to believe because it's almost at full power. Just Elf is really missing. But I just don't think Sprite offers you that much when it comes to what the deck does nowadays as like pure Sprite. It does everything just all right. It doesn't have great follow-up without Elf. It has an all right first turn. It has an all right going second. It has less non-engine slots usually than something like Fire King. I just don't see what it does better than other decks is my problem with Sprite. Vanquish Soul, I'm going to put it in the high C. I think there is one thing that we have to realize is that we are coming from a time in Yu-Gi-Oh where for months and months now there has been a lot of diversity in these formats, right? And we're kind of getting used to almost every deck being somewhat viable, and the same is true before Phantom Nightmare. Like all of these decks are really viable in the current environment. I think the problem is that with Phantom Nightmare and Fire King Snake Eye, you are putting one new thing into the game at the very top, and I think that significantly changes how viable a lot of these previously tier 2, B tier, whatever you want to call it, decks are, because Vanquish Soul, Sprite, Unchained, Flu, Exo, I don't see these decks consistently perform in an environment of Fire King. I don't really see it. Let's move on to Phantom Nightmare archetypes. Snake Eyes, just pure Snake Eye, Diabell Star. Usually you're gonna play like Jet Synchron. You're gonna have Synchro plays available. That's basically the whole idea of the deck. is still gonna be, I think, an S tier strategy. Judging from the OCG, they are currently highly in favor of playing the Fire King cards in the Snake Eye deck. That does not change the fact that it is theoretically possible to play the deck without the Fire Kings and just do your pure Snake Eye thing. Which of the two ends up being better in the TCG is hard to tell. I can say from my perspective at the moment, I have a hard time imagining a reason why you wouldn't want to play the Fire Kings, because the Fire Kings, they add a lot to the deck with very little cost. At the same time, the Snake Eye deck seems like the kind of deck that with the Jet Synchron and everything, it can go really crazy. Maybe that's something that they don't want to do because of Maxi, which could end up being the difference maker. It is true, Jordan. The Snake Eye deck puts up negates, right? Whereas the Fire King deck doesn't, right? The Fire King deck has a lot of interaction still, but it doesn't put up Baron or Savage, which the Snake Eye deck can, right? I'm looking forward how it's going to be developing in the TCG where we don't have Maxi ruining some of the fun. So we'll see. Now we have a lot of stuff that is a little bit harder to evaluate because it's not just as clear as, well, it's a fire deck, so it's going to be the best. Now I have taken a look at Voiceless Voice. I have looked at its combos. I've looked at its potential. I'm going to have to try it a little bit more though. But my first impression is that Voiceless Voice is a solid deck that has decent room for non-engine, plays decently well with just one or two cards. Relatively linear gameplay though. However, I genuinely think one of the main reasons why it is so close to like rivaling fire decks in the OCG right now is the fact that it plays very well under Max C, which is a bonus that we lose in the TCG. And that is something I know we keep reiterating over Max C here, Max C this, Max C that when it comes to these OCG comparisons, but it can't really be understated how big of an impact that card makes, right? A deck maybe isn't as powerful as another deck and therefore maybe loses some games because it's not as powerful, but then has a better matchup into Max C means that it doesn't auto lose to Max C, so it kind of evens out, is a big deal, right? If the deck is not good enough in the TCG, not powerful enough, then the Max C bonus doesn't apply and then it just ends up being solid. So my opinion on Voiceless Voice is that it's at least a solid deck. It's at least here. I would not be surprised if it ends up being a strong contender, but I think it's more realistic that it's going to end up being in the top of the B tier. By all means, try it out. I think it's a good deck, especially if you don't want to spend the money on all the cards that you need for the fire decks, right? Between Branded, Lab, and this is a completely okay choice. I'm not saying it's cheap, but it's cheaper than those. I'm gonna very quickly throw Goatee into experimental because I'm gonna be honest with you, I've seen those cards. I know that they are good cards and I have seen a lot of people already start messing around with it. The problem is I haven't yet and I have no idea how good it actually is until I have messed around with it. So the new cards are solid. I think they have some potential, but where exactly it's going to take you, I don't know. I don't think it's going to take you into S tier, that's for sure. But it can take you somewhere. Maybe you can discover a strong or solid deck with the Goatee cards, but I can't say for sure. Goblin Rider or Goblin Biker. I don't love this deck that much. I would say it's gonna end up as a rogue deck somewhere like right down the middle. They're cool cards and like a couple years ago I could see them take over the metagame. At the moment I don't see it. I wanted to include Ashen just to get my opinion on Ashen out there. I think for now this is not even experimental, this is just a not yet situation. You will not play this deck until the next wave of support, and then it depends, is the next wave of support good? Simple as that. For now it's nothing but copium, really. Vados is a solid non-engine, but not even for this format, I don't think. Magispector, to me, the Link monster is good, but it's also a huge choke point at the same time because it's like all of the Magispectors aren't targetable, but the Link monster is, which means it just imperm Baylor premium target essentially. Kieran is still banned. Second of all, your thing will constantly get negated, and third of all, like, you're locked into Magispectors only, right? That limits your options. Well, I think it's a rogue deck, but I think it's like, don't get me wrong, everything I'm putting into rogue here is like something you can definitely be completely fine with on like locals or regional level. Like I think Magispector is something that you can play and take home your locals with on a good day, right? But from a competitive perspective, I don't see a reason to play Magispector. As a whole, one thing you can definitely notice is that the upper ends of the tier lists are getting slimmer with Phantom Nightmare. It's basically like a previous tier list where there was a lot of viable stuff. Everything moves down by at least one. And like towards the top, we're not going to have that many different decks anymore. I don't think it's going to be just fire. I think there is still decks here that can rival the fire decks to some capacity, like Branded, Lab, Voiceless Voice, and honestly, everything else I've thrown into Solid are all decks that are still okay. They're just not better than fire, but they're still viable. Once again, leave a comment down below. Let me know what you think of the tier list. You know, which things am I wrong about? Because once again, this is based off my first impression. I hope you found that helpful. Goodbye, YouTube viewers. Thank you for watching. Appreciate any feedback in the comments down below. Appreciate if you subscribe to the channel as well and like the video. Always helps a ton. And I will see you guys next time. Bye bye. Peace. Thanks for watching.